The bayous of Louisiana hold secrets in their dark waters, and Spanish moss hangs from ancient cypress trees, like the ghosts of memories that refuse to fade. And in the summer of 1942, a young woman named Odette Marie Thibodeau stood on the porch of her family's shotgun house in Thibodeau Parish and watched the fireflies dance above the sugarcane fields while somewhere, across the ocean, a war was consuming the world. She was 21 years old, and she had worked at the Charity Hospital in New Orleans since she was 17, learning to care for the sick and the dying and the forgotten in wards, where black patients were separated from white patients, but where death made no such distinctions, and where she had discovered that her hands possessed a healing gift that no amount of segregation could diminish. Her grandmother had been a trader, a traditional healer who used prayers and herbs and the old ways that had survived the passage from Africa to the Caribbean to the swamps of Louisiana, and she had taught Odette that healing was not just about medicine, but about the soul, and about seeing the person beneath the pain, and about never giving up on anyone, no matter how far gone they seemed. When the Army sent recruiters to New Orleans looking for medical workers to serve overseas, Odette was among the first to volunteer, because she believed that if American soldiers were dying on foreign soil, then she had a duty to help them, no matter what uniform they wore or what color their skin happened to be. But what happened next changed everything. The transport ship crossed the Atlantic in a convoy that stretched to the horizon, and Odette spent the voyage caring for soldiers who were already sick from the rough seas and the close quarters and the fear of what awaited them, and she moved through the crowded holds with a calm presence that seemed to ease suffering just by being near. They landed in England in the spring of 1944, and Odette was assigned to a field hospital unit that would follow the invasion forces across the Channel, and she spent the weeks before D-Day preparing supplies and training with doctors and nurses who had never worked alongside a black woman from Louisiana and who did not know what to make of her quiet confidence. She crossed to France 10 days after the initial landings, and the beach was still littered with the debris of battle, and the air still smelled of cordite and death, and she walked through that landscape of destruction with her medical bag clutched to her chest and her heart pounding with a fear she would not let show on her face. The field hospital was set up in a bombed-out schoolhouse 5 miles from the front lines, and the wounded came in waves that never seemed to end. And Odette worked 18-hour shifts, holding hands and changing bandages and assisting with surgeries and writing letters home for soldiers who could no longer hold a pen. Yet she never imagined this moment would reshape her destiny. In August, the hospital was ordered to move forward as the Allied armies pushed deeper into France, and during the relocation, a German counterattack cut off their convoy, and Odette found herself separated from the main unit with only a young doctor named Captain Robert Sullivan and 3 wounded soldiers who could not be moved. They took shelter in a farmhouse basement while the battle raged above them, and Odette kept the wounded stable through the night, using skills her grandmother had taught her and techniques she had learned at Charity Hospital, and a determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than training. The Germans found them at dawn, and Captain Sullivan tried to explain that they were medical personnel protected under the Geneva Convention, but the soldiers who captured them were not regular Wehrmacht. They were SS, and they did not seem interested in conventions or protections or anything except completing their mission, and then something no one expected. Instead of executing them on the spot, as Odette had feared, the SS officer in charge ordered them loaded into a truck and driven east away from the front lines and deeper into German territory, and she realized that they were being taken somewhere for a specific purpose, though she could not imagine what that purpose might be. The journey lasted 4 days, and they traveled through a landscape of devastation where cities had been reduced to rubble and refugees clogged the roads, and the machinery of war ground on, despite the obvious fact that Germany was losing, and Odette watched it all through a gap in the canvas covering of the truck. They arrived at a facility that had once been a sanatorium nestled in a valley in the mountains of Bavaria, where the air was thin and cold and the pine forests pressed in from all sides like walls, and Odette understood immediately that this was not a normal prisoner of war camp. Behind these ruins a secret waited. The sanatorium had been converted into a medical research facility, and the Germans needed workers to help care for the patients who were being used in experiments, and they had brought medical personnel from the captured convoy because their own staff was depleted and the work had to continue. Odette was assigned to a ward where young German soldiers lay in beds, suffering from injuries that had been deliberately inflicted and infections that had been deliberately introduced, and she was expected to help keep them alive long enough for the doctors to complete their research. The horror of what she witnessed in that facility would haunt her for the rest of her life, but she made a decision in those first terrible days that would define everything that followed, and she decided that she would not become complicit in what was happening, and that she would find a way to ease suffering without contributing to the experiments. She began secretly providing comfort care to the patients when the German doctors were not watching, and she used techniques from her grandmother's teachings to help them manage their pain, and she whispered prayers in the old language that had survived across centuries and oceans. What she discovered next would shake even her commanders. Captain Sullivan was kept in a separate area of the facility, but Odette managed to communicate with him through a network of sympathetic workers who had been conscripted from the local population and who hated what was happening as much as she did. Together they began documenting everything they witnessed, keeping records, hidden in places the Germans would never think to look, and gathering evidence that they hoped would someday be used to bring the perpetrators to justice. A young German nurse named Helga became their ally because she had been raised to believe in healing and could not reconcile that belief with what she was being asked to do. And she began smuggling extra food and medicine to the patients and passing information to Odette about the movements of the guards and doctors. The winter of 1944 was brutal in the mountains, and many of the patients died from their injuries and infections, and the cold that seeped through the walls of the sanatorium in Odette held their hands as they passed and memorized their names so that she could tell their families someday what had happened. She developed a system for recording information, using a code based on the musical scales she had learned from her father, who had played piano in a jazz band on Bourbon Street, and she wrote her observations in what appeared to be random marks on scraps of paper that she hid in the lining of her uniform. The end came faster than anyone expected when American forces broke through the German lines in March of 1945 and began sweeping toward the Alps, and the staff at the sanatorium realized that they would soon be captured and that their crimes would be discovered. The chief medical officer ordered all records destroyed and all patients eliminated to prevent them from testifying, and Odette knew that she had to act or watch everyone she had been caring for be murdered in their beds. She found Helga in the supply room, and together they developed a plan that was desperate and dangerous and almost certainly doomed to fail, but was the only chance any of them had. That night they drugged the guards using sedatives that Helga had been stockpiling. And they opened the doors of the wards and they helped as many patients as could walk to escape into the forest. Well, Odette stayed behind to care for those who could not be moved. The Americans arrived at dawn, and Odette was standing in the main ward surrounded by the patients. She had refused to abandon, and she was holding the records she'd kept hidden for 6 months, and she told the commanding officer everything she had witnessed. Captain Sullivan was found alive in the basement of the facility, and Odette's account, and together their testimony helped convict 7 German doctors and 3 SS officers at the Nuremberg trials. Odette Marie Thibaudot returned to Louisiana in the summer of 1945, and she walked back into Charity Hospital as if she had never left, and she spent the next 40 years caring for patients in the same wards where she had learned her trade. She never spoke publicly about what she had experienced in Germany because the memories were too painful, and because she did not want to be defined by the worst thing she had ever witnessed, and because she believed that her work spoke louder than any words ever could. But she kept the records she had made, and she donated them to a museum in New Orleans before she died, and they remained there today as testimony to what happened and what she did to document it. Helga survived the war, and she and Odette corresponded for decades, exchanging Christmas cards and photographs of their families, and meeting once in 1972 when Odette traveled to Germany to visit the woman who had helped her survive. Captain Sullivan wrote a book about his experiences that included a chapter on Odette, and he called her the most courageous person he had ever known, and he dedicated the book to her and to all the medical workers who had served in the war. The people of Thibodeau Parish did not learn the full story until after Odette passed away in 2003 at the age of 82, and when they did, they erected a statue in the town square showing a young woman with a medical bag walking forward into an uncertain future. Her great-niece became a doctor, and she works at the same hospital where Odette learned to heal, and she keeps a photograph of her great-aunt on her desk, and she tells her patients about the woman from the bayou who walked into hell and came out with her humanity intact. The fireflies still dance above the sugarcane fields in summer, and the Spanish moss still hangs from the cypress trees. And somewhere, in those dark waters, the spirits of the ancestors watch over the descendants of those who survived and those who healed and those who refused to let hatred win. This is the story of Odette Marie Thibaudot, the captured hospital worker from Louisiana who witnessed the worst that humanity could do and who responded with compassion and courage and an unshakable belief that every life has value. Her legacy lives on in the patients she saved and the records she kept and the examples she set for everyone who came after her. And her story reminds us that even in the darkest places, the light of human kindness can never be completely extinguished. And in a museum in New Orleans, visitors can still see the scraps of paper with their strange markings and learn how a young woman from the bayou used music and memory to document atrocity and preserve truth. She did not think of herself as a hero, but heroes rarely do. And what matters is not what we call ourselves, but what we do when no one is watching, and what we choose when every choice seems impossible. Odette Marie Thibodeau chose humanity, and that choice echoes through the generations like a song that will never end.